Okay, so let's start this meeting. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live talk number 6. My name is Anaïs, and I am the PARM Community Manager. So happy International Women's Day. We will do our live talk today on exploring new frontiers in gender, smart climate and disaster risk finance policymaking toolkit. This live talk is organized and promoted by FAMD and the InsuResilience Global Partnership within the framework of their engagement together with the Platform for Agricultural Risk Management and the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Before starting, I wanted to quickly go over some housekeeping rules. First of all, this webinar will be recorded and available on our platform and in replay that will be sharing on our social media and on our website. At the end of the webinar, we will dedicate a quick session for you to ask some questions, but you are more than welcome to use the chat box, which you will find on the bottom of your screen so that you can ask us questions and we will direct them at the end of this session. Also, I will now share on the chat the link to our community of practice from FAMD. This is an interactive space for exchanges and to receive peer-to-peer support on agricultural risk management, but also to share knowledge and best practices. So we highly encourage your subscription and look forward to exchange with you on this platform. If there is any technical issue, you can use the chat box also and write directly to FAMD so that I can try and help you to resolve these little problems. And without further ado, I will now leave the floor to Ines for welcoming remarks. Thank you, Ines.
Thank you, Anaïs. And hello, everyone. On the occasion of International Women's Day, I'm happy to welcome you all to the Live Talk 6, Exploring New Frontiers in Gender Smart Climate and Disaster Risk Finance Policymaking, a Toolkit. My name is Ines Perez, and on behalf of the InsuResilience Centre of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions, I would like to welcome you guests and speakers to today's event. A special thanks again to our colleagues from FARMD for your support and co-hosting the event, which is part of our Live Talk series covering topics related to gender and CDRFI. Just briefly on the Center of Excellence, we're a knowledge-sharing platform that is hosted by the InsuResilience Centre of InsuResilience Global Partnership and co-financed by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and Global Affairs Canada. Our platform is filled with life and knowledge products by a great community of gender champions, policymakers, and practitioners from the Gender Working Group. Among many things, we commission studies, step-by-step guidance notes on how to create, on how to create gender-responsive CDRFI. We organize events like these and offer scholarships to high-potential women leaders and much more. Last year, we launched the Center of Excellence Technical Advisory Facility, offering free advisory support for your gender activities. We invite you to explore our platform and feel free to get in touch with us for more information. As Anaïs mentioned, today's live talk marks the official launch of our latest toolkit for policymakers, a step-by-step guidance to assess gender responsiveness of CDRFI-related policies. I would like to invite participants to please use the chat function to make remarks, ask questions, and share any interesting details of your own work in this area during the webinar. You can also find a PDF copy of the toolkit for policymakers online at the Center of Excellence at coe.insuresilience.org. We can also share our resources via Twitter handle at IGPGender. I now hand over to Catherine Miles, our facilitator, to provide an overview of today's agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines. Next slide, please. So during this live talk, we'll be sharing insights from this toolkit for policymakers. As it said, it's a toolkit to support you in terms of a gender-responsive approach for climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. In doing so, we really want to set out the entry points for gender smart CDRFI related policies, and also discuss examples of good practices and gaps for policies that incorporate macro and micro level instruments. Next slide, please. Today's agenda is going to consist of a brief presentation followed by a panel discussion. And we're joined by some fantastic speakers with a wealth of experience on this topic who'll share their expertise and insights with us. We've got Angela Abdullah, a gender analyst from African Risk Capacity, ARC. We've got Tuga Alaskari, technical specialist risk financing and gender lead at the Insurance and Risk Financing Facility at the UNDP, so United Nations Development Programme, and Sarah Bertoni, Director, Leadership and Diversity at Women's World Banking. And last but not least, we have Manoj Pandey, Asia Pacific Coordinator at V20 Sustainable Insurance Facility. Next slide, please. So these are our great speakers that we've got, and we'll come back to them shortly. But before we start, we're going to have a quick participant question. Anne, I'm going to pass over to you for the participant inputs, please.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, we want to all participants to start and have some. We have a question for you, so I will launch one poll now, and please participate if it will be really helpful. We have two questions for you, so we are looking forward to have your answer. The first question is, what is your primary policy entry point for gender smart CDRFI related policy making? I see that already some people are answering. A lot of people actually. And now the second question also, where do you see the greatest opportunities for new frontiers in gender smart CDRFI related policy making? Okay, I see the numbers growing, so keep on participating. It will be very useful for the rest of our webinar. Okay, I see the participation is growing, so we're almost half of the participation. Yeah, I will wait a bit more. I see that people keep on answering. Okay, I will end the poll now. So for the last one, if you want to answer, it's your moment. Okay, I will now share the result. Okay, Catherine, if you can see my results, please jump in so you can.
Thank you, Anne. So this is great to see. So we are using the terminology CDRFI a lot today, so forgive us, it's a difficult acronym to be pronouncing all the time, but it means climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. In terms of primary entry points, what we're seeing here is that there's pretty much equal when it comes to policy entry points that people are focused on in terms of inclusive insurance and disaster risk financing. However, some of you then, I think thereafter, enter this policy discussion from an agricultural policy perspective, followed by climate change, closely followed, and then a slightly smaller number of you are focused on adaptive social protection as your main entry point for this, and a few of you are other areas. What is really interesting to see is when you see the greatest opportunities here, the majority of you, so over 3/4 of you, are saying that the policy engagement process is where there's the greatest scope for opportunities. Thereafter, some are saying 38% policy results measurement, and a smaller number, so just under a third, are stating policy content is where the opportunities are. So thank you. I think this provides us a really good framework to start our discussion. And at this point, I think we're going to move on to the presentation just to set the scene. So next slide, please, Anne. So today, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction to the policy level gender entry points and practical action for CDRFI set out in the toolkit. Now, firstly, although many of you are probably already aware of this, what we mean by gender is the social, behavioural and cultural attributes, norms and opportunities associated with being female or male. And these are learned through socialisation processes and are context and time specific, and they can also change as well. Next slide, please, Anne. In terms of gender entry points, when we use this term, we're talking about opportunities to consider the influence of these norms on different aspects of CDRFI policy and shaping these norms through intentional policy making processes. So about the toolkit, what are we doing with this toolkit? Back one slide, please. Thank you. The toolkit aims to help you and your advisors with the development of gender-smart CDRFI policy approaches and improve outcomes that can address differences in women's and men's vulnerability to climate-related extreme events and disasters. The toolkit itself is a self-assessment framework to support you to identify existing gender practices, but also gaps in national CDRFI-related policies and develop recommendations to make these policies gender-smart. These are policies that incorporate CDRFI instruments, for example, as we've seen from the different entry points that you come to this debate from. National disaster risk financing strategies are one, others are national adaptation plans and national and financial inclusion strategies, amongst others. So there are lots of different policies that incorporate these instruments. So this toolkit provides both principles which specifically emphasize a need to focus on policy content and the policy development process, as well as the intersectional nature of climate and disaster risks and impact. And what we mean by that is it's not just gender, but also other factors such as age, ethnicity, or geography that may have implications for an individual's climate and disaster risk profile and protection needs. There are 6 entry points highlighted in the toolkit, and you see them here on the screen in front of you. For each, I'm going to give you a few very illustrative examples of the how practical policy actions can be taken. The why for each entry point is set out in the toolkit, along with resources and other policy examples. So do look at that later for more information there. So with the first entry point, this is international and regional and gender CDRFI related commitments. By this, what we mean is that governments can publicly make and implement such commitments to build the case for gender smart CDRFI. This is because a public commitment can be the first step towards action. One concrete action that could be taken is to conduct a review of country progress against these commitment statements that your country has signed up to. The second entry point is women in leadership and workforce gender diversity in the CDRFI value chain, as this can be promoted in entities focused on CDRFI related policy making and regulation, for example, in insurance companies. So to address this practically, one thing that you can do is gather and in turn analyse baseline data on women's leadership and gender diversity and workforce participation in A, insurance companies, or B, in the insurance regulator and insurance supervisors. Turning now to entry point 3. We call this gender smart CDRFI related strategies, plans and budgets. Now these can address the gender differential impacts of climate-related extreme events and disasters. And these strategies take many different forms related to the policy areas we referred to a moment ago. Now, how can this be done? This can be done by promoting the use of gender-based vulnerability data and risk modelling, or recognising gender differential impacts and structural gender inequalities with women-targeted strategies in policy content. Another action is using gender-related criteria to inform budget allocations, such as prioritising funding to address gender-based violence. Turning now to entry point 4, gender smart CDRFI in national financial inclusion strategies and insurance sector diagnostics. Now, what do we mean by this? This refers to policies integrating a dual focus on climate and disaster risk insurance instruments, as well as gender differential barriers to access and usage of insurance. And at the moment, we're not necessarily seeing that, but more to that later. What can practical action be? Well, it can involve collecting sex disaggregated supply and demand side insurance data and analysing it to identify gender differences in levels of access and usage of insurance, as well as setting sex disaggregated climate risk insurance objectives and targets in these plans, and as a result of these diagnostics. Entry point 5, institutional coordination on gender equality and CDRFI related policies. So what do we mean by this? This is the creation of coordination mechanisms between policymakers responsible for these policies to ensure policy coherence. Now, actions related to this could include establishing a working group, including the ministry responsible for gender equality and women's affairs, to ensure that the information sharing between different policy areas, and also that there's coherence at a national level in terms of policy content with any national gender strategies. And that relates to structural barriers facing women's access to insurance. Now, finally, the last entry point that we have taken in this toolkit is the collection analysis of sex disaggregated CDRFI relevant data. And this can be collected and analysed by national statistics officers and other agencies to generate insights to inform policy level gender good practices. Examples of this data might be data on disaster mortality, economic losses, asset ownership, financial inclusion in the gender gap there, and also insurance access. And another related action is conducting capacity building of individuals collecting this data on the value and how to use it. So finally, just to show on this last slide, a snapshot of what the policy toolkit self-assessment framework looks like. Essentially, it has a series of questions in a table format that you can ask to establish the extent to which certain gender considerations are integrated in your policies and work related to each of these different entry points. And for some questions, there's maybe a simple yes, no answer, but for some, when issues might be partially addressed, then there is the tick box partial. In all cases, the recommended policy actions are detailed to support you to close any of the identified policy gaps and opportunities for enhancing gender approaches to CDRFI policy making. So we really hope you're going to be able to take this tool and use it, and we look forward to receiving your feedback on it. So at this point, we're going to start with our panel discussion, and this is hopefully going to bring to life the toolkit itself and some of the topics and entry points that have been raised just in this brief presentation. And the panel is focused on making the case for gender smart macro and micro level CDRFI related policies. What are emerging practices, challenges and future opportunities? So thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. Okay. What we're going to do with this panel, we're going to start with more of a macro focus on this, because there are different kinds of instruments. We've got macro instruments and micro instruments that we often talk about in terms of CDRFI. But first of all, we're going to go to Angela Abdullah, who's the gender analyst at African Risk Capacity, and we're going to hear first of all some of your views on what you'll be doing related to policies here. Now, in the presentation, we've heard about this cross-cutting gender entry point and the themes of both institutional coordination and sex disaggregated and gender data. And this is something that I understand that you've been addressing through your work, Angela. So the first question to you today is, what is the role of institutional coordination between policymakers to promote gender smart CDRFI policies? And how do you use sex disaggregated and gender data to inform your CDRFI related policy making? So over to you, Angela, first of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon to all of you who have joined this session on this very special day, the International Women's Day, and congratulations to all of us. Wishing you all a very good day. So going straight to your question, let me start by explaining that we do, through our gender strategy, which was approved in 2019 at ARC, we support countries to actually make regional and national commitments to participate in gender analysis process that indicates what the gaps, the strengths and weaknesses are, and the potential priorities in terms of action. And this then culminates with the policy dialogue. So this is a participatory process that draws on gender data. And through that, we also support the capacity of collecting sex segregated data including also, issues on financial inclusion and insurance access. So that we have to use and to actually inform strategic approaches and risk understanding, risk modeling, and monitoring of the implementation of risk insurance in relevant policies. So that is through capacity building of the individuals collecting the sex disaggregated data and its value and how to use it. So the policy dialogue, as I said, is the culmination of the gender analysis conducted in each country, and it provides an opportunity to actually for institutional coordination through bringing all the actors together to determine priorities for action. And it involves from women's groups to ministries in charge of gender and women's empowerment in the policy process. Well, I could give some examples as a result, just to illustrate the work that we have been doing. For example, in Malawi, one of the recommendations of the Malawi policy dialogue has to do with the increasing investment in gender responsive disaster risk management and financing. And it points out to the mobilization of resources and the creation of gender funds dedicated to financing of gender mainstreaming activities and addressing underlying structural inequalities in disaster risk management. So according to this recommendation, such a fund should be aligned to the disaster fund proposed in the DRM bill, but implemented independently with the joint coordination of disaster risk management affairs and the Ministry of Gender, Community Development and Social Welfare.
That's great, Angela.
Another interesting proposal is about the allocation of 5% of the disaster fund proposed in the new DRM bill to support dedicated investment in rural women's economic empowerment and access and control over productive resources.
Thank you, Angela. That's really great to see how the work that you do at a regional level has then gone down on the ground to influence policies very tangibly. Thank you. We'll come back to you and learn more about some of this work in a moment. Let's move on to Tuga now. And Tuga, you work as the risk financing and gender lead at the Insurance and Risk Financing Facility at UNDP. And I know that you use data as well to inform the work that you're doing, and you've got a coordination approach as well. Maybe could you just provide a bit of an overview on the current practices and gaps in incorporating gender considerations and CDRFI policy making from your perspective, focus on this risk finance?
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. And it's really great to be speaking on this topic on International Women's Day, and also to reflect on, InsuResilience Centre of Excellence has really pushed us all along to advance on this agenda. And the conversation we're having, I feel, is quite a bit more detailed than maybe we were having a couple of years ago, where we're just sort of talking about the gaps, but not really. We didn't have the toolkits that you're generating at the moment. So congratulations on that. So yes, as you say, I work for UNDP in something called the Insurance and Risk Finance Facility. It's a flagship initiative of UNDP. And what it does is it focuses on bringing insurance and risk finance solutions towards the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Part of that involves working very closely with the insurance industry to structure insurance and risk finance solutions for development, for the Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, the first step of all our work, all our country projects, is we undertake what's called a diagnostic, which maps out the key hazards that affect a particular country, the sectors, how those hazards interact with vulnerability, what existing disaster risk financing policy frameworks are in place, what the insurance market currently looks like, what the regulation around that is, and so on. And on that basis, we then work with governments and our industry partners to identify perils, to focus on a subsector, to focus on a regional focus, and then we start to structure a solution. So that diagnostic is a very critical tool to help us understand the problem and identify the solution. So what we do at UNDP is, it's very important that gender is not an afterthought. We don't start to integrate gender once the project is already identified. So within the diagnostic framework that we have at every step, when we talk about hazards that affect a country, when we talk about the social protection mechanisms in place, we're looking at it with a very strong lens related to gender. We collect gender disaggregated data. And the way we do that, and I really appreciate the toolkit you've developed, is through questions. So the methodology we have has very targeted questions that need to be answered at that stage when we're gathering data that ensure that we're not, we don't have gender blind spots, and that we are informed as we start to shape this. Now, the second important step is we set up committees. So insurance industry together with government representatives, as well as UNDP country and regional representatives. And within that, we need to ensure that there is a very good gender lens. And that's different. We leave that down to each country to determine. But in some of them, it has, our gender focal points will be there, but also if there is a ministry that focuses on gender, they would be there. In Vietnam, we have, for example, the Women's Union as part of the committee that is shaping this work. So that's an important step. One last thing I'd like to say is, guidance is really important, and really unpacking every step of the process is quite important. It's all well and good to say that we're committed to gender, and UNDP has, through InsuResilience, committed to the gender declaration. We took that and we unpacked it and applied it to our program. And today on International Women's Day, we've just launched the UNDP Insurance and Risk Finance Facility gender commitment. And that's very specific about how we will include gender every step of the way. I'll share the link in case anyone wants to look at that.
Congratulations, that's fantastic news. So just sort of building on that, and thanks Tuga for sharing these insights and your approach at IRFF. Angela, what are you seeing now then as emerging practices to incorporate gender considerations within CDRFI related policy making within the region where you're working?
Right, well, thank you again. So for us at ART, the Gender Transformative Fund being launched as a funding mechanism to strengthen the institutional mechanisms of the ministries of women's affairs or in charge of gender, and also funding gender-related activities to build resilience of women. So this is the main framework of resource mobilization, strategy, and approach for gender transformative risk management, which is outlined in our gender strategy and action plan for disaster risk management. So one of the key features of the transformative funding is the introduction of this gender transformative fund to support initiatives that transform mentalities and eliminate discriminatory norms and practice, especially at the community level. So we think this is a game changer in ARC's country programs, as it makes room for women's leadership through the involvement of the ministries in charge of gender equality and women empowerment.
Thank you, Angela. That's fantastic. And this is really interesting to see how actually resource mobilization is connected with policy, actually, and that in itself is a policy lever that can be pulled. And I think this is something that Tuga, you've been looking at as well in terms of resourcing, and there's some synergies between the approach that has been taken by ARC and some of the work that you're doing at IRFF in terms of resources. So how are you practically working to close the gaps that you've been identifying in gender smart CDRFI policy making and getting this sort of practical action on the ground?
Thank you, Catherine. So all the work we do, so we operate in every country on a macro level, looking at the strategic frameworks and how we can influence those. and how we can crowd in insurance for governments to strengthen their sovereign risk management. But in every country we work in, we're also focusing on stimulating local markets so that they could also come in and crowd in resources to support the Sustainable Development Goals. And one way in which we do that is through an Innovation Challenge Fund, which we are also launching today. So lots of announcements coming out today. And that has a very strong gender lens. So when we're channeling funds out, we have the opportunity to put in criteria that ensures that the projects are developed with a strong gender lens, with gender considerations, that the committees that bring them forward, I think this was mentioned in your presentation, Catherine, it's very important to overcome potential blind spots related to structural inequalities related to gender. So having diverse committees that develop these projects is very key to ensure that we are taking a broader perspective and avoiding those blind spots. So our Innovation Challenge, which was launched today, has a set of criteria that need to be met to ensure that the projects that are supported have a strong gender lens. One other way that we're working, and this really, I think, will resonate with the InsuResilience Centre of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions, is to try and connect the dots. We're really learning as we go. This is quite an innovative and niche area, insurance and risk financing. And so we've established with the national programme officers that lead each of our country projects, a community of practice essentially. So we've shared our initial gender commitment, we've shared the diagnostic methodology, which has a very strong gender lens. We've tried to transfer the knowledge of why these questions are important and how they could overcome certain gender gaps. And then as we evolve, we also are bringing forward some best practices. So for example, I mentioned in Vietnam, the Women's Union is part of the team that's shaping the project there. In Jordan, there is a very strong gender lens in the work, and within the work plan, there is a knowledge piece that would focus on Jordan and the nexus between gender and disaster risk financing, but it could be useful for all our countries. So we're trying to share that information, and I've made a little note that the toolkit you've just developed will definitely be shared with all our national officers, because the self-assessment part of this will be very valuable.
Thank you, Tuga. So again, we're hearing about the role of finance with policy making, but also engagement on social norms as well, and addressing structural barriers coming through as themes that you've been addressing through your work, and also touching on the participation of women. And I think that now really takes us to Sarah. I'd like to bring you in now. So Sarah, you work as the Director of Leadership and Diversity at Women's World Banking. And an area you focus on is women's leadership and workforce gender diversity. So why is this topic relevant for CDRFI policy making, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I'm delighted to be here representing Women's World Banking's work in this space. Just briefly before I answer the question, Women's World Banking provides advisory services, asset management, training on leadership and gender diversity, really with the aim of giving more low-income women access to the financial tools and resources essential to their security and prosperity. This includes making insurance work for women, which we do through our caregiver product. So now to respond specifically to the question, really broadly, I'll start by talking about what we know about the value of diversity in organizations, especially having women represented in organizational leadership. We know there are benefits for organizational effectiveness and performance outcomes, improved effectiveness of leadership teams, including better decision-making, more innovation, and more engaged and productive workforce. There's also a case around mirroring the market that is being served to develop products, services, or policies that are responsive to the needs of the end consumer or beneficiary, especially in this case, taking into consideration gender differential risks, preferences, and access to banking services, insurance. And especially with something as sensitive and complex as insurance products can be, there are benefits that we see to having women as sales agents who are going out into the field and offering those products and services to women customers. At a more macro level, there's also evidence that increasing women's representation on boards of banking supervision agencies correlates to greater stability in the banking system, as well as enhanced economic growth, which I think is a strong argument for regulators and policy makers that are concerned with these issues of stability and growth. Thinking specifically about CDRFI policymaking, women are critical players in climate resilience. And so it's really important to have women's voices and involvement related to policymaking, and that bringing those voices to the table where strategies and approaches are being developed. So in Women's World Banking's work with regulators and policymakers, we really look at the role of these entities from two levels. Regulators and policymakers play a dual role in making sure that women are represented across institutions in the insurance industry, across the financial sector. So internally, how can policymakers and regulators model inclusive policies and practices in their own talent management approaches, and work to become employers of choice for women, which will benefit their own organizational health and help to close the gender gap in financial inclusion. And at the sector level as well, policymakers directly influence those institutions that fall under their regulatory sphere. And I know that the structure of how insurance and the financial sector is regulated differs from place to place, but actions that can be taken are similar, regardless of structure, in terms of women in the workforce, women in leadership positions, and really influence creation of gender responsive policy and practice among supervised entities.
Thanks, Sarah. So there's clearly a real business case on doing this. And whilst we talk about the business case, it's also relevant for public sector institutions as well and regulators. It's not just about the private sector. So I think that's really key when we think about this. And also that it's about the content of the regulation and policy and the internal looking element to the institutional policies. And we're going to turn to Manoj now. Manoj Pandey, you're now Asia Pacific Coordinator at the V20 Sustainable Insurance Facility, but you've also had previous experience working on this related theme in your previous capacity at the Access to Insurance Initiative, A2II. So, picking up on some of the themes that Sarah's touched on, how can national financial inclusion and insurance sector policy specifically related to within that scope integrate this focus on micro level sort of gender smart climate disaster risk financing instruments, or address these sort of gender related issues within regulation and supervision? Over to you, Manoj. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. Really delighted to be here. And as you mentioned, I am the Asia Pacific Coordinator for the V20 Sustainable Insurance Facility. So the V20, or the Vulnerable 20, is a forum of ministries of finance of the most climate vulnerable countries across the world. And while the name is V20, we currently have 58 countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America who are members of this group. And as most of the V20 countries are emerging economies, MSMEs are the key drivers of employment, of GDP, of socioeconomic movement in these economies. And the sustainable, and of course, the climate vulnerability that these geographies face, the MSMEs are not immune to it as well. And that creates a lot of challenge for these entities. And that's why the Sustainable Insurance Facility was visualized. It is hosted by the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme's finance initiative, and supported by the German government, BMZ, of course. As I mentioned, that this is a forum, the V20 is a forum of ministries of finance across the V20 countries. The finance ministries are also where the financial inclusion strategies at a national level are generally developed. And looking at and something like the Sustainable Insurance Facility being a part of or being led by the ministries of finance, what we are observing is that financial and even previously that financial inclusion policies need to have gender considerations to begin with in terms of basic access to finance, like bank accounts, basic access to credit, and things like that, and of course insurance, and then incorporating the climate and disaster risk resilience perspectives into it. So there's definitely where I think the template can be set for emerging markets to be more specific. And staying on the theme of entrepreneurs, to take this example forward, when you consider women entrepreneurs, they are of course challenged by the challenge of accessing credit or something to that effect that MSMEs in general face. Access to credit, capacity building, regulatory and lack of clarity on a lot of regulations and support around that. But within that, we have to understand the fact that women entrepreneurs, especially micro and small entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs face special challenges because the networks, the information sources are generally male dominated, and women have to work double hard. Women entrepreneurs have to work double hard to get the same access to support that male entrepreneurs might get, which not be much, but there's definitely a handicap that women entrepreneurs have. Now take that forward to insurance, MSME insurance specifically, and that becomes doubly challenging because of course insurance, as we know, is lower on the pegging order when it comes to other financial pressing requirements, and that's not different for MSMEs as well. And this is what we are trying to change at the SIF, especially in those geographies where climate risk is definitely a huge challenge. You talked about my previous role, and there's something that I can definitely draw from, is that being the gender lead, the thematic lead for gender at A2II, we did this work around mainstreaming gender at the A2II. And one of the things that struck me was that whenever regulators, insurance supervisors, and regulators talk about gender and things like that, they say, oh, we are gender neutral and it's absolutely fine. We are not creating any structural challenges. But what we found out through the work that we did together and also the work that followed up on that, we found out that insurance supervision and regulations need to be gender aware rather than gender neutral. And I can go back to the, I wouldn't say invisible, because I think that's really reducing it, but actually the structural issues that exist in emerging markets, for example, where male-dominated marketplaces might not be the easiest places for women to access, if that is an insurance sales point, or get more information on the kind of risk financing solutions are there. So there's definitely a lot of need, again, to incorporate both gender requirements, but also accessibility and having a focus on how distribution and the services reach women entrepreneurs in particular, but women in general across markets.
That's
I'll stop
great.
here.
And I think, well, there's two things here. One is, again, you've come back to this structural constraints, and there's this increasing recognition, and it's great on International Women's Day that we're recognizing those constraints that are facing women in their diverse roles as well. Not all women are the same. And also the fact that you've talked about going from this focus, which is more traditionally in CDRFI, we've been focusing on individuals in the past a little bit in the early stages of the debate, but we're moving now to MSME focus. And now we're doing that. We need to focus on saying not all MSMEs are the same. If you're owned by a woman, if it's owned by a woman, they're going to be different challenges. So thank you for the work on that front. Now, Sarah, just moving back to yourself, just in terms of women's leadership and diversity in workforce participation, what policy actions can be taken to promote this in climate risk insurance policy making and regulation from your experience?
And, picking up on what Manoj has just said, we like to say that if policies or products are not designed with women in mind, they're designed for men. So government entities play an important role in a variety of ways, but first and foremost in, setting the tone for the sector in terms of gender responsiveness or gender awareness. And they have policy levers that they can pull to influence the sector. So first, establishing sector goals or mandates, for example, requiring a certain % of women at the board of directors or senior management level of regulated companies. The other panelists have also spoken about the importance of sex disaggregated data. So policymakers, regulators can require sex disaggregated reporting on critical key KPIs that are related to women's inclusion as employees in the finance sector. Just as an example, the G20 Empower Alliance suggests 5 key performance indicators for monitoring the female share of the workforce. So female share of workforce, and breaking that down by career level, the % of female employees that receive promotion. So looking at that pipeline, monitoring the gender wage gap, looking at boards of directors, and also thinking about where are women? So where are women in technical or STEM-based roles? We've recently done some research in Nigeria looking at advancing women leaders in Nigeria's finance industry. And there's been a variety of factors contributing to some positive growth in that particular market in terms of women's representation in leadership in the banking space. And among them is a 2012 CBN mandate. So these policy levers really can make a positive difference.
That's really great to see. Thanks, Sarah. And maybe Manoj, just on your side, what are you seeing as sort of emerging practices and opportunities related to CDRFI policy approaches from your experience? Thank you.
So I'll actually just talk about the work. I'll start by talking about the work that we are trying to do at the SIF. So the 3 ways in which we are looking to promote, to create a pipeline of projects that are aimed at providing climate risk financing to MSMEs is by being a catalyst of bringing stakeholders together, enabling access to technical advisory, and also providing pathways to financing of such projects once they get to that stage. And we have to bring gender lens as part of our policy on those 3 aspects. So what that essentially means is that when we are putting together stakeholders in a particular geography, in a particular market, to design a project or discuss a project, we make sure that we have a representation there, either as women leaders from the stakeholders that we work with, could be banks, insurance companies, fintech organizations, or demand side entities which represent women agriculturists or agribusinesses or any other kind of MSMEs that we might be working with. So that's something important. Also equally important is that when gender considerations are put in place, to be put in place, the advisory that we get also has that component of making sure that gender considerations are incorporated from the very start in a particular project. And while it's a very blanket term to say gender considerations, but essentially about the last mile connectivity, making sure the information is accessible for women and stuff like that, understanding what the structural challenges that exist in the market. And that's where, sex disaggregated data, which unfortunately is not very prominently available across markets. And that is true not just for insurance solutions per se, but also for general credit and savings products per se. You might have high-level assessments, but one of the things that we are looking, whenever we are looking at projects or different markets, is to get a sense of women's participation in the MSME, women's share in the credit portion, reaching the MSMEs and things like that. And from there, we can draw upon, again, then, pointers towards how the CDRI solutions needs to be designed to make sure that gender gaps are minimized going forward. And that's where I'll just go back to greater representation, both in terms of entities representing women entrepreneurs, for example, but also within diversity of leadership within organizations, irrespective whether they have a dedicated gender agenda or not, if they are just a financial player in the market. And then, of course, better disaggregated data, but not just for insurance per se, but across the financial services value chain. And I think those things are gaining greater traction. Definitely, there's a lot of conversation around it, but definitely things can improve.
Thank you. And I think this is, where there's a huge opportunity to inform policy making related to CDRFI, but actually there's still a challenge, and that's something that we need to work on. What I'm seeing, just to thank you all for sharing your fantastic insights, but just to sum up, really what we've heard is this real importance actually of data, and data to inform policy content as well, in the diagnostic phase, in that assessment phase, but also in the content of policies themselves, setting KPIs or setting targets that are disaggregated by male and female. Notwithstanding, I see the comments in the chat box that there are other gender identities out there, but typically these days we still are just collecting males and female data, but it could be disaggregated differently going forward. But what we've also seen is the theme of representation coming through, and ensuring the representation in the policy process, and also in informing the policy content, and making sure women are participating, they're at the table, that they're creating the policies and informing the policy. So in those two roles, in the creation and information as well, in their diverse roles, and not all women are the same. And then this theme of social norms as well, and addressing that in policy content through engagement that you're doing, and that includes providing financial mechanisms and resources out there to support that engagement, to underpin the policy development and implementation process. So really thank you for all these great insights. We could be here for hours. It's wonderful to have you all sitting here and sharing, and we might come back for a few questions shortly. But at this stage, I'm going to then just hand back to Anne from Farm D, who's going to pose the next participant question to everybody on the line. And thank you for staying with us, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much to all the panelists. And to all the participants, we need one more time your participation. So I will share the second poll. I hope you can all see it, and I will read the first question. So what are your thematic priorities for gender smart macro level CDRFI policies and budgets? And the second question is, what are your policy priorities for gender smart micro level policies and regulation? CDRFI policies and regulation. Okay, I see people are already participating. Okay. The numbers are growing. So for the first question, you have multiple choice. You can answer either childcare infrastructure, gender-based violence risk mitigation, women's economic empowerment, livelihoods, gender inclusive transportation infrastructure, gender-based reproductive healthcare needs, or you can specify something else. And for the second question, you can either answer 6 disaggregated data, the gender protection gap, women's workforce participation, innovative distribution channels, or you can specify other. Okay. I still see people participating, so I will wait for 1 more minute, and then I will share the results. Okay. Okay, let me share the results so that Catherine can analyze the results. Okay, there you go.
Thank you very much. So with your thematic priorities, the one that has come out top looks to be at 79% women's economic empowerment and livelihoods. So figuring that into the budget priorities. Then thereafter, we've got gender-based violence. I know that's a real cross-cutting theme that's increasingly getting more attention, which is good to see because of its severity. We've also got thereafter the reproductive healthcare needs that are gender-based, coming in with 21%. And we've got similarly the gender inclusive transportation around the same. And then we've got childcare infrastructure there afterwards. So we're seeing the majority of you think that the livelihoods element is the main priority. And actually this is an important consideration, because when budget priorities are made, if money is directed to one economic sector and women don't then participate in that economic sector, then they're not going to be the beneficiaries of it. So having that in the policy making process, in budget prioritization, is absolutely critical. Likewise, we know that the gender-based violence is an impact of disasters and climate-induced disasters as well. And yet, if that isn't being factored into budget priorities, then that becomes a huge blind spot. We're not going to be addressing that issue. So those are key things to consider. When we look at policy priorities, well, it probably is no surprise that data, given that we've spoken quite a lot about that today, is a significant priority. More than half of you have highlighted that, and also the protection gap. So assuming that refers to at the micro insurance level, but we've still got women's workforce participation, a key priority, and there are slightly few of you highlighting the need for innovative distribution channels, but it still is definitely still needed. We're not there yet. So thank you. This is really great to just get that insight from you all. So thank you for that. Just as we start drawing to a close, I know that some comments have been made in the chat box, so we can come to them in a moment. But one thing I just did want to highlight to you, we heard of some great resources that are online that our speakers have shared today. So just to recap, there are these scholarship opportunities that you can apply for. So look online for that. And I know InsuResilience is supporting some of those scholarships. So I think Sarah's shared a link for that. There is the IRFF Gender Commitment and Challenge Fund, both of which that have been launched today. So again, look at those. These were highlighted in some other research that has been done by all the different organisations represented today. So thank you for sharing those resources on the chat function. And if there are other resources that you want to share, just pop them in the box before you leave so that we can ensure that they're disseminated to all of the participants. Ines, going to turn to yourself, and are there any reflections of other questions that have come up that we can pose to speakers today?
Thank you, Catherine. I think the only other question that popped up was Andrea de San Jorge's question on gender disaggregated data. And basically she was asking whether there were any recommendations in the toolkit on how to include non-traditional gender in CDRFI, such as transgender and non-binary. And if you could perhaps identify some challenges and opportunities for this. I mean, we could address this to the speakers, but I think also as well to you, Catherine, perhaps because it's related to the toolkit directly.
Sure, absolutely. So we don't go into detail on this at all in the toolkit, I'm afraid. I do recognise that this is an issue and does need to be explored further, and it's very much at the sort of cutting edge of where this debate is going. I think the challenge that we've got is even getting sex disaggregated data in terms of males and females at this stage, let alone having, in addition to that, these other categories that are being increasingly in some country contexts being collected, but it's not universal yet. So it remains a bit of a challenge. I do want to just open the floor to the speakers in case anyone wants to just step in if you've seen any good resources on this topic around data collection, and if so, has anyone got any resources that you'd like to share before I hand back to Ines? Just unmute yourself if you do. No. And I think this is go ahead.
No, Catherine, I just wanted to highlight that yes, this is something that is definitely has not been given enough attention as it should. The only point I wanted to highlight is that countries like India even are now starting to accept a non-binary gender response, and that has been now approved by the Parliament, and all government forms which ask for your gender has a third gender option in there. It's not the perfect solution, but I think we are seeing a trend, and in time we will see. But definitely we see a lot of positive starts which are definitely encouraging, and they can only gain pace going forward.
That's fantastic, and thank you for sharing us that example, Manoj. And I think Nepal and maybe Cambodia or other countries that potentially disaggregate certain data points nationally, but again, perhaps because of social norms in countries, sometimes that information isn't routinely captured necessarily at an institutional level. There's a difference between what nationally is maybe encouraged or required, or data that's even collected through censuses, for instance, and how that then permeates at the institutional level within financial institutions, and specifically within insurance providers as well. So there are remain challenges there, but great to see that this is something that is on the radar, and there's some movement. So thank you for that. At this point, I'm going to then hand back to Ines, and I think we're going to move towards the close. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And a warm thanks to the panelists, and again to you, Catherine, for the rich discussion and for sharing your important insights with us today. I feel you have provided us all with great food for thought on how to continue to promote gender responsive CDRFI at the policy level, and what aspects to consider and keep in mind. Taking advantage of the momentum, I am excited to announce that applications are now open for the new cycle of the COE's Technical Advisory Facility. Interested organizations are invited to apply to receive free tailor-made advisory support on how to integrate gender and CDRFI considerations into the policy development process and content. The deadline closes on March 31st at 11:59 p.m. Central European Summer Time, so please hurry up. Lastly, I would also like to ask participants to keep in touch with both the InsuResilience and PARM-D. And before you disappear today, please provide us with your feedback on the webinar via the evaluation. Thank you all, and have a lovely day.
Thank you to everyone. It's the end of our webinar. Thank you for everyone for your participation in this webinar, and thanks to InsuResilience Global Partnership, of course, and the InsuResilience Centre of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions. I remind you to check out the link to our PARM-D community of practice that you will find in the chat box, and any other information that the panelists shared. And don't forget that at the end of this webinar, you will have an automatic survey to fill in and share with us your impression about this webinar and your suggestion for future events. Thank you to everyone, and goodbye.